Unbiased information.
Honest and forthright.
News without the misinformation.
It doesn't matter what side you're from. What matters is what you say, the truthfulness behind it.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to this live broadcast. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. You're live and direct for the next 2 hours. I want to welcome onto the call right now Sam Husseini. He is an independent journalist. He's also a correspondent at the State Department in Washington, D.C., and he's joining us on the live link right now. We've got Sam via cell phone today. Sam, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Patrick. Thank you.
It's great to have you as well. Sam, there's a lot that's happened in the last 48 hours. I'm not sure where to start. Firstly, let's start with the big story. What is the feeling? What's the reaction in Washington on this? I don't know what to call it, an Israeli retaliation against Iran or not. It's hard to figure out exactly what happened through all the media noise. We're still sifting through. We can't see much of a retaliation there. What are the sort of shockwaves on this, if any, in Washington?
Well, I think in the sensibility in establishment Washington is probably, I think, a degree of satisfaction. The big question to me is why exactly did it go down the way that it did? That is, there were lots of reports that Netanyahu was going to hit Iran, was going to restrain himself somewhat vis-a-vis Iran and get U.S. acquiescence, some kind of formal acquiescence in terms of going harder on Gaza, including into Rafah. So that would be kind of a remarkable development that you would be able to proceed. This whole thing with Iran could end up having a very ironic effect. Right? Netanyahu initiated this by bombing the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So what has followed from that? Iran attacks Israel, makes it look like the victim. They just got the genocide supplemental, as many people call it, through the U.S. House. Tons of cash for Israel, as well as Ukraine, as well as Taiwan, sort of going at their pivots against all three civilizational centers, in effect, Islam, Orthodoxy with Russia and China. And now he may well have a green light, and they also eclipsed the U.S. veto at the UN. So I realize that, as you say, Patrick, there's a lot that's going on, and I don't mean to conflate everything, but I am saying that I think that people are shortchanging in a lot of analysis as to how Machiavellian the U.S. strategy is. Their job is to undermine international law in order to continue using military force with Israel as they wish for their ends, to keep the money flowing for that, and to pretend that they are not in brazen violation of international law in the process. And they fundamentally succeeded at that. They are certainly pushing things, but the fact that they got the money through Congress, and the fact that Israel, can pretend to have restrained itself in spite of all of the atrocities that it's committing on a regular basis, is a substantial accomplishment by their Machiavellian standards, in my view.
So that's something that I don't think people realize. Israel has pulled off potentially a great transaction for themselves here. So all these things, so you line all this up, U.S. voting against Palestinian statehood in the UN Security Council, U.S. sending, tens of billions of dollars to Israel, additional above and beyond what their normal sort of stipend that they get from Washington, and also maybe a green light for Israel to announce the development of settlements in and around the Gaza area, which Netanyahu seemed to be pointing towards there. So all those things lined up in exchange for what? That they'll show restraint. I can totally see Israel basically pulling the marionette strings of Washington, using this opportunity to its advantage to get things that it wants on the ground. That's kind of what it looks like from here. This is a huge win, I think, in a way for Israel. I mean, in the bigger picture, Sam, they're losing, they're hemorrhaging support globally, but at least they still have some leverage with Washington. Is that what it looks like?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that they have a very wide legitimacy crisis, but that hasn't manifested itself as it should. And they have enormous benefits. And sometimes, I mean, there are a lot of good analysts out there who are critical of Israel who will point to, that Israel and the United States, it's estimated, spent over $1 billion to respond to an attack from Iran that only cost like $2 million, or that's the estimates that I've seen. Well, yes and no. I mean, I'm reminded of the Julian Assange quote. The point is not a successful war. The point is a continuous war. That the funding can continue from the U.S. taxpayer into the military-industrial complex, so that the war can continue. So, and as we said, they just got more money through the House of Representatives, or at least it's on the path to getting additional funding. So, by their very, selfish parameters, this does seem like a win in many ways. The other side of it, as I referenced, the lack of legitimacy hasn't yet manifested itself. You've had successive U.S. vetoes of Security Council and now Palestinian statehood at the Security Council. You've had orders from the International Court of Justice that have not manifested themselves. Nothing has forced them to stop. There have been a lot of great statements by a lot of countries at the UN and elsewhere. I think the next step, and I know I've raised this before on the show, is to force things to go to the General Assembly through Uniting for Peace. The Palestinians and others have allowed themselves to be confined to the Security Council, where the U.S. has a veto. And that doesn't seem like a strategy to me. And I think that there is probably a great deal of U.S. pressure to bear on countries to not take things to the General Assembly using Uniting for Peace. But ultimately, I think that a lot of people who, rhetorically are critical of the U.S. and Israel have to sit up and do that. I'm thinking of Brazil and Turkey and Algeria, as well as Russia and China. They've been very critical of the U.S., but they keep running into the U.S. veto with the Security Council. Well, there's a way around that, or at least a way that you can attempt to go around it using the Uniting for Peace process, getting 2/3 in the General Assembly, and really trying to force things and to force this legitimacy crisis to continue.
There's another quid pro quo item, Sam, that at least some of the Israeli reports over the last couple of days have indicated that the invasion of Rafah, the imminent invasion of Rafah that Israel's been threatening to do, this is where all the Palestinian refugees have been basically forced into this very small geographical area near the Rafah border crossing in the south of Gaza. And the Israeli press are insinuating that Washington's given the green light to Netanyahu to go ahead with that operation in exchange for showing restraint in retaliating against Iran. Do you get any indication that that one's on the table there?
Well, I mean, that's been raised by a number of people, including at the State Department briefing yesterday. At least that's how Israel is attempting to spin it and how the U.S. is attempting to spin it. I mean, I think that Biden and Blinken and Israel are very closely disconnected in terms of their worldview, in terms of their interests. It's sometimes hard to know where one begins and one ends. So I think in some respects, Biden was itching at a way to try to give Israel a green light without appearing to be completely complicit in the genocide that Israel is perpetrating, and him, allegedly making Israel restrain itself in its strike on Iran. It may provide a fig leaf for him to say, "Oh, I prevented a wider war. Aren't I so great? So I got to give Netanyahu Rafah," which is completely insidious and diabolical and murderous. But I think that that's the way they're going to attempt to spin all of this.
Yeah, I mean, Israel has created a tremendous amount of leverage, believe it or not. That's an incredible thing, Sam. In the position that they're in, with what they're being charged with, what they've gotten away with in the last 6 months, they still have managed to create all these levers on Washington. It's just incredible. I think it really speaks to the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and it's not a harmonious, symbiotic relationship anymore. It's very manipulative, and again, Israel looks like it's in so many different ways trying to hold Washington hostage. But how long was this going to last? Because do you think that what happened on April 14th when Iran struck the Israeli positions in this massive drone and missile salvo, many of them were intercepted, but not all of them were, is that a game changer, do you think, in the long term, Sam?
I'm not sure. I think that some of my friends are overstating that, because it shows that Iran can potentially do genuine damage to Israel. But I mean, that escalatory cycle ultimately bumps up against Israel's nuclear weapons, right? I mean, Iran can't go to the max in terms of just realistically with Israel, because Israel can flatten Iran, and it could dust Moscow. Israel has that nuclear capacity, and Iran doesn't. Iran can do a tremendous amount of damage to Israel, and one could imagine a scenario where a lot of Israelis feel uncomfortable and start deciding that life would be better in Brooklyn and London rather than Israel. But it's a very limited game change, because the escalatory cycle ultimately, Israel ultimately has a trump card. And the relationship between Israel and Washington, I think, is more complex and insidious than we sometimes give it credit for. I mean, it depends by what you mean by the U.S. If we look at the U.S. public is getting shafted here. The taxpayer is getting shafted here, yes. But the establishment Washington, with its military-industrial complex, is so tied to Israel in terms of big tech, in terms of surveillance, in terms of this war in Gaza being an AI war, and you get to try out new weaponry and continue the wider colonial project. There's so much invested there, and the personalities involved of Biden and Blinken, who have been, diehard Zionists for decades upon decades. They helped ensure that the Iraq invasion happened. They kneecapped Scott Ritter when he stood in the way of that agenda, and so on. I think that there still is it's tough to say it's a symbiotic relationship, because it's not helping the American public. But between this narrow class of establishment Washington and Israel, I still think that they are wedded at the hip.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, how this is going to shape up in terms of, well, we'll wait and see what Israel's going to do. If they're going to seriously retaliate against Iran, what would that mean in terms of Iranian counter strike, or are we going to see a slight freeze here in the escalation ladder between these two countries? It's going to be very interesting, very revealing in the coming weeks and the coming months to see. We hope that things don't escalate, of course, but there's always a chance that they might. Now, the other thing, Sam, is what is your sort of sense right now going into the summer with the Trump is right now mired in lawfare. We got all these trials going on lined up in New York. So he's going to be tied up at least for the next couple of weeks or months there as well. But in terms of the Biden administration, Biden's reelection campaign, how they're positioning themselves right now, and how is this farrago in the Middle East going to affect the Biden administration? Do you see any main differences between the Trump camp and the Biden camp on foreign policy? And is there any chance for contrast between these two candidates, or are we looking at much the same when it comes to both?
Yeah, I think it's different flavors of the same noxious toxin. Biden will attempt to portray himself as being a steady hand who prevented a wider war, if indeed we don't see any further escalation between Israel and Iran. That to me is faulty. I think what we have seen is the militarists in Israel getting what they want, and some folks in Iran being able to say, we're standing tall. But that leaves the Palestinians in a complete lurch. It in real terms, I'm sorry to say, has not helped the Palestinians. So Biden will attempt to say, look at me, I calmed down the situation. Imagine if Trump were president, he would have gone bonkers on Iran and we would have had World War III. And Trump will attempt to say, if I had been there, then none of this would have happened, and I would have waved my magic fingers, and so on. So, I mean, they are both, different flavors of massively backing Israel and its genocide, and they work effectively in tandem, in spite of the fact that they, appear antagonistic to each other before the American public. But that's what keeps the U.S. establishment going, and I think you effectively have a majority among the American public against this. I mean, you just saw the protests at Columbia University, protests elsewhere. I think that you have people on the right who are saying, what the hell, as well. But all of those forces are kept at bay as both branches of the establishment fundamentally agree on the direction of U.S. policy.
Yeah, you had a little bit of a dust up as well, didn't you, in the State Department briefing? I'm not sure the name of the chap who you were locking horns with this week, Sam, but I think you were challenging him on, does the U.S. recognize the Geneva Convention, I believe, or just some basic international law standards. What was that all about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've asked this repeatedly in November and then again recently, and they've either been evasive or deceptive or parsing their words in a way that makes it totally hollow. And I asked, I got two questions in this week. Matt Lee of the AP eventually followed up on it to try to force an answer from them. And, what's really going on is that the U.S. government is parsing out the Geneva Conventions so that they fundamentally do not apply to Gaza or the Palestinians in general. So they are denying the Palestinians a one-state solution. They're denying the Palestinians a two-state solution. And they're denying the Palestinians even the protection that is normally afforded to people under the Geneva Conventions for people living under occupation. And this is fundamentally their attempt to create this legal edifice that allows Israel, or they pretend allows Israel, to fundamentally make Gaza and potentially the West Bank now more and more into a free fire zone, so that Israel can kill people at whim and have no legal recourse set up against it. And that ultimately is done because of Washington. That's not something that they can pretend to blame Netanyahu about. They are formulating this legal construction.
And this is one of the problems with this obsession with labeling armed resistance or armed liberation struggles as terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. And that's from that sort of intellectual dishonesty and political Machiavellianism springs more bad policy on top of that. So I think you got bad after bad after bad. It really kind of starts with that idea that if you can label some people or anybody terrorists, then it pretty much gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want to eliminate them, including an unlimited amount of collateral damage, which it seems, Sam, that the American people have been, I guess, groomed into accepting unthinkable levels of violence against civilians. I mean, that seems to me one of the big takeaways of the last 6 months. I mean, a lot of people are noticing this in the attitudes, the blasé attitudes, especially of U.S. Politicians defending Israel's actions on this. What do you think on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was all coordinated with a massive propaganda effort, and the whole terrorism mantra was certainly part of it. Ignoring the fact that Hamas largely targeted military facilities on October 7th was part of it. The entire edifice of propaganda about beheaded babies and mass rape atrocities and so on. That was all part of the genocidal intent. All of that propaganda was put out there in order to facilitate Israel's carnage and slaughter of civilians in Gaza. And you've had some pushback as a result of that, some domestically from the United States and some from South Africa and other countries at the International Court of Justice. But fundamentally, nothing has dislodged it. And you continue to have the reign in Washington of this, establishment from the so-called left and the so-called right, where they are continuing to fund this. The quote-unquote lawmakers in Washington continue to back the perpetual wars, and the whole, it's tied to Ukraine in terms of the propaganda around, provoked. Israel didn't provoke Iran when it bombed the consulate. It's even claimed the same way that the claim is that Russia wasn't provoked vis-a-vis the Ukraine. So there's a whole series of fabrications around that in order to perpetuate this. And again, I go back to my point about having an authentic left and right that are coming at this, anti-establishment, somehow formulating an anti-establishment center as being critical to meaningfully stopping and challenging this dynamic.
And that's the option that you're offering up on this is votepact.org. If you go to Sam Husseini's social media pages as well, you'll see links to that as well. So that's something that you're floating out, Sam, as a potential option to that sort of logjam that we are just encountering at every turn, especially on this issue of funding wars overseas in these different theaters.
Exactly. Instead of people, self-loathingly voting for Biden or Trump, they can pair up and both vote for third-party candidates. If there arose a third-party candidate that could draw support from both the left and the right, sort of a combination of, Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich or something like that, that would be a conceivable path to literal electoral victory, a peaceful electoral revolution. And I think it's more than just, issue of war. It's civil liberties, it's Wall Street bailouts, it's gutting Main Street, It's corporate trade deals, the Federal Reserve policy, a whole litany. And I think part of what happens with this left-right dynamic is that the establishment rams stuff through, and then the left and the right bicker about it. Take immigration, for example. Desperate immigration in the United States is largely caused by U.S. interventions, corporate trade deals, and drug laws. But the left and the right could fundamentally agree on those things, so they could actually agree on the root causes. So then they wouldn't need to bicker about, oh gosh, we got all these immigrants. What do we do with them? You wouldn't have desperate illegal immigration if the establishment wasn't able to ram through their horrid policies on those deeper structural issues.
Yeah, the irony of the immigration issue is there's a although that's a real emotive issue on this conservative right, they absolutely want it to be there and up in flames right up to the election day because it's a huge rallying cry. And the left also have some issues like this. Certainly, abortion's one of those wedge issues they want to keep stoked as hot as possible right up to the moment of voting in November. And then after that, Sam, after the election, it's like, oh, the can gets kicked down the road again, and it gets sort of filed to the back of the cabinet. So we see this time and time again. But that's certainly something to consider. That third-party candidate for me would have been Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had his position on Israel and Gaza not been so horrific. I probably would be putting him forward for a big vote pack effort, Sam. But unfortunately, I just can't bring myself to do it. But it's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, it's tragic what he did to his campaign. I mean, that certainly is a huge part of it. That he was just so hyper pro-Israel. I mean, just even more than anybody else on the stage right now. But his campaign is now being run by his daughter-in-law, who's a former CIA agent. There's a whole litany of issues and question marks around Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at this point. I mean, I did a ton of work on lab origins. He cites me in his book, but he hasn't made that a real campaign issue. I mean, he hasn't gone around to the labs that are doing this dangerous lab work in the United States to raise a public ruckus about that. So his campaign in a lot of ways is filled with all kinds of bizarre aspects that don't lend to trusting it in any way, in my view. It's
baffling, and it's a shame because he still will get a lot of votes. He may end up being, even after this huge disappointment, as you described here midstream, he might end up being one of the most successful third-party candidates in terms of total votes in November. That might still happen. The question is, what's it going to mean in terms of policy differences? Is that leverage going to mean anything in the end? That's the big question. But Sam Husseini, I really appreciate you joining us on TNT Radio this week. Much appreciated again.
Sure thing, Patrick.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. Be sure to visit Sam Husseini's Substack column and also follow him on X, Twitter. He's doing amazing work. Sam has got his finger on the pulse of some of the biggest stories week in, week out. That's why we try to stay in touch with him. Look, we're going to take a break right now with the network, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up some of the huge headlines before the top of the hour. So stay with us. We'll be back in a few.